Welcome to Innovation Tales, your go-to podcast for the human side of digital transformation.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Innovation Tales. What goals does your organization have for its digital transformation? Often we focus on efficiency gains, faster time to market, and stricter compliance. But these dry business terms tell only half of the story. My guest today is Glen Finch, and he makes a passionate argument that while solutions may be digital, success can only be achieved if organizational goals are matched to the desired outcomes of their people. Together, we explore the art of designing human experiences in an era of rapid technological change. Stick around to hear how an expert uses empathy and creativity to craft moments that matter in order to deliver differentiated yet sustainable innovation. For many years, Glen drove cross-functional teams to leverage design thinking with a hands-on approach. A senior director of innovation design at Pegasystems, he is widely recognized for his strategic skills building successful, human-centered practices and establishing a design culture. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Glen Finch. Glen, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
It's great to have you. I've interviewed a number of Pega experts for this first season, but I believe you have a very unique and important perspective. When I was at Pega, I think you were the first UX person I met at the company.
Quite likely, yeah.
Yeah. So can you start by sharing with our audience, what was it like to be a designer at Pega back then?
I can try, yeah, if memory serves me well enough. So as you said, I was the second hire in that space in the professional services community. And the first one that actually worked in the EMEA region. So yeah, when I started, I was very much tasked with being a hands-on role. But it quickly made me realize that, actually in that space in Pega and a lot of companies like that, the focus was really around on the technology side and making sure that we understood what the business was trying to achieve. And there really wasn't much consideration of the humans that were going to be at the end of those experiences. So I had to spend a fair amount of my time helping to orient my colleagues as to what the role was and, what the value that was intended to bring, and then also to start to socialize and to make our clients aware of that as well. So, I don't like using the word education particularly in that sense, but certainly to raise their awareness and help them understand where it fits in within, that overall spectrum of engagement and developing solutions that span across business communities, particularly when it's something that's not actually going to be directly consumer facing itself, but it's going to service those employee experiences, but those are ultimately still part of how customers or organizations get serviced.
Yeah, and I was one of them, wasn't I?
Yes, you were. You were very much.
I remember some really long brainstorming session where we were mostly just looking for ways to deliver great UX, but without customizing the platform.
Yeah.
And I felt like it was it added a lot of value, that bringing those two perspectives together was very useful, wasn't it?
Yes. I think you raise a really good point of course, you can completely tailor a bespoke experience based on your understandings of who that consumer of that product or of that solution is going to be. But like most things, the more and more effort you put into it, you start to hit a point of diminishing returns, where, you might go from a 90% great experience to 95%. And then from a 95% great experience all the way to 100, you're probably going to put more than double that effort in for more than that 5% gain. So there reaches a point where you're trying to balance and evaluate, what's the propensity of that organization, and what's the actual viability of them to spend that time and effort and money ultimately. And is it worth them doing that for the experience that they want to deliver and for the difference that it will make, both to those people consuming the experience and to the organization itself?
Yeah, it's not a black or white or anything. It's a pretty structured, I guess, discipline where just like you said, you're looking for, the right balance.
Echoes of Innovation.
So Glenn, for this segment, we use storytelling to bring authentic insights to our audience. But I always advise my guests to use discretion with names and specifics.
Sure.
To honor confidentiality agreements, of course, to respect people's privacy. With that in mind, can you think of maybe a story that you can share that would illustrate the importance of experience design?
We did some work a while back that was in a space that's perhaps not typical for what we do, but it was around funeral homes and mortuary care. So, looking at that whole experience about, a very pivotal moment in people's lives, which is dealing with death and mortality. But obviously there is a service there that needs to be executed, needs to be done effectively, needs to be done well and efficiently for that organization to be able to run well and to also be able to satisfy their customers at the end of the day who are going through a really difficult moment in their lives. And they had been using, Pega as a solution to help them manage that effectively so that they have, standardized approaches so that they could ensure an excellence of care for their customers. And one of the challenges we faced was while they were executing their delivery okay in terms of, hitting agile sprint goals and things, there was really a big disconnect and they were starting to see some resistance among the community that would be adopting that. And that spanned across from funeral care home managers, funeral directors, and ultimately down to the people that were, carrying out some of the work in preparing a body ready, for whichever type of service it would be.
To help us grasp the context, who were the people involved? Because you came from the Pega side, of course.
Yes. So we obviously had the client, and then there was a partner involved that was executing the delivery, that had provided a lot of the support for an organization like that. Didn't have the largest IT network. It did have some. But they were helping support a lot around that.
Was it like a project that was an IT project or a business-led project? I know there isn't like a black and white description, but it's always nice to understand who's championing the introduction of technology.
Yeah, this was a business-led initiative in terms of the organization had got to a size where their previous structures and systems no longer supported them. And over a period of growth and some acquisitions, they actually ended up with non-standardized working practices or workflows and systems that really didn't support them in their modern need in terms of understanding that excellence of care was going to be delivered.
Okay. All right. And so you come in and you aren't there from the beginning, right? You're saying that they're underway.
They had already started their journey, yeah.
And so what were the issues that you saw from the experience design side of things?
So from the experience design side, we were seeing things getting built, but really that understanding of context of use and the situation and understanding of what was, as I said, in those people's minds as they were going through that. So, if I'm a funeral director, what is going through my mind when I'm dealing with people in this incredibly sensitive moment in their lives? In some cases, very soon after a bereavement and a body needs to be collected to be taken away. So, it's an incredibly sensitive area where empathy also is obviously very important. And we did see that, they had some design effort applied. But when we were looking at it, we looked at the personas they had generated. And while they did try and paint a human-like picture or snapshot of what that role was, some of the really important things were missing. So the personas detailed quite a lot of tasks that needed to be done and what needed to be carried out. And it, did have some information around who this person might be in terms of their background. But it really missed kind of making a connection for the development team in understanding what the context of those situations would be like. So we managed to go out and spend some time observing and interviewing some of the people in those roles to try and actually build them out so that they were less just about tasks and duties, but really helped create a clear understanding for the teams that were going to be building the solution, what those roles looked and felt like in practice.
I'm guessing that it wasn't the easiest of tasks, in the sense that, no, of course, you still do, the same thing that you would do with another organization, but given the context, I'm guessing that the reason why maybe no one had done this to that level before was just that it wasn't the most comfortable of things?
I think not comfortable, and obviously, if that's your company, your organization, there's a degree of reticence about wanting to let people, loose in the zoo, if you were. So, there was a lot of making sure we dealt with things tactfully. They understood how we were going to approach this, that it would be non-intrusive. So obviously, while we desired to get the greatest amount of first-hand knowledge possible, one of the things we specifically didn't suggest was having a designer ride along, with a funeral director on a first call to take notes while some family's going through, a life-changing experience.
Yeah,
and that's something we specifically didn't. Yes, would be completely inappropriate. Yeah. So we interviewed funeral directors and went through a process of asking them to reflect on their experiences. And in that interviewing, rather than just ask them generically, you would ask them to say, like, okay, what was the last call that you went on? Talk us through that. Talk us what it felt like, how it was, how many people were there, what you were dealing with. So we gave them very specific questions to make sure that the information we were getting back was directly relatable to an experience that they had fresh in their mind, rather than asking them to generalize. So I think one of the great things that came out of that experience is, while the company was looking to drive some greater standardization to help maintain excellence of care, one of the drivers behind that was we have a lot of handwritten notes, which can sometimes lead to interpretation errors when someone else is reading them or things get lost. So they wanted to digitize this. Not unique to this industry. And obviously one of the ways they thought could be really beneficial for doing that was to have a tablet or, a phone of some form to take that information. One of the challenges that we managed to uncover through this process was in that mental mindset of the funeral directors, why they always carried a leather-bound notepad, was they were very concerned about the families or the loved ones feeling that they might perhaps be engaged in something else on their phone, texting a friend or on social media. They never wanted to convey that. It was very important for them to make those families and those loved ones feel that they were 100% in their moment, attentive to them, and very, respectful and aware of their situation. So it didn't negate that a digital solution was possible, but it did mean that we were able to make some recommendations that stretched just beyond what the screen looks like, to say, hey, if you actually have, nice covers created for a tablet that perhaps has the company name on there, it becomes more evident that actually what they're doing is work-based in that moment, and it is a work tool rather than they're texting their loved one about, perhaps what they're going to have for dinner that night.
But that clearly makes sense, to differentiate that this is a work tablet, this is a work device, not, yeah. And when we were preparing this, you kind of told me that some of the techniques that you use, for example, for mapping personas, weren't standard in a way, because normally a persona is not a concrete person. It's more of a amalgamation, something that is symbolic.
Yes.
But in this case, you told me that you actually went and had the specific people included for, persona mapping. Can you explain a bit more, at what point does that make sense? You're just normally following standards, but in this case, I guess it's the situation, it's the context, it's the type of work that people do. What was it?
And in this instance, the type of work that they do and the realities of what they do. was really important in helping the delivery team get that level of empathy and understanding about what that really meant that was paramount. So while the majority of the information in there that we comprised was a synthesis of multiple inputs but disseminating kind of data, and then the contextual and qualitative information that we gained from the interviews, all of that followed a standard persona format. Where we diverged was, rather than using some kind of stock photography to represent the person in terms of bringing a face to life, we really needed to convey what that person in that role looks like. Mm-hmm. So the simplest one was probably, the care team that went and undertook the removal of the body. It was really important to show that they were wearing blue latex gloves. And the delivery team needed to understand that while that didn't mean that you couldn't use a touchscreen, there were certain considerations that had to be built in there of, like, they're dealing with a body that, there were bodily fluids involved, and sanitation becomes a concern, and touchscreens are less sensitive when you have gloves on. So now we need to take that into account of saying the button size might need to be slightly larger when we have to do this, because the tactile nature is not going to be as accurate. So all of that information is so much easier conveyed through a picture. Mm-hmm. In this case, a picture really spoke 1,000 words. And I think the one that really struck the team home most from the feedback I got was when we actually got to, actually having the preparation of the body for like embalming. And again, the idea was we need to capture this information digitally. But when you see someone that's completely dressed out in protective gear, that's necessary to undertake essentially what is, a procedure. The idea of them being able to stop every few moments, either clean their gloves or remove their gloves to capture some information system and carry back on, it's not going to get the efficiencies you were hoping to try and drive. You might get some standardization, but you are going to lose out on the flip side with like the interruptive nature of that.
So it may be a lot of pushback, I'm sure.
Yeah, so it may just shift our thinking to say, like extra development effort to suggest that capturing through voice is going to be far more beneficial for you, even though the project will change focus and scope now a little bit. That uplift beyond what might be considered a standard back office operational procedure was incredibly warranted in terms of the business value that would be deemed on the other side. So that was a really big shift in terms of understanding the scope change is relatively easier to think about than the estimation of what will the impact or the value be delivered on the solution on the other side. It's not impossible, but those ones are often harder to do, particularly when you have people that are involved.
And once you've had communicated those observations and shared the information with the partner and the rest of the team, how quickly were they able to use that information in order to improve both the solution, but especially the experience of the people?
I would say there's like a multifaceted answer. So, at leadership level, some of this immediately resonated as where they were perhaps seeing disconnects. And as I said, their delivery schedule wasn't really the challenge. The challenge was they didn't feel like they were achieving the goals or the outcomes that they intended in those timeframes. So I think at that level, some of that immediately connected. Obviously, when you have to now try and work through the motions that you have as a delivery organization, that takes time for that to be able to cascade for the teams to actually get back to their operating procedures and their regular rate cadence for being able to work through a backlog and deliver through for testing and ultimately adoption. So that took a little bit longer for that to cascade down. And in some cases, there were challenges because it's a change. You're instituting a change when for some people, they feel like they are operating really effectively already. But I will say, it managed to go from that top level right the way down to the individual developers, which ultimately means that we are succeeding in kind of making those pivots that we need to, based on learnings that we acquire, which is really what Agile should ultimately be about.
The story you've shared with us extremely powerful, but also unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that this is kind of a very specific case, or is this a relatively good illustration of what generally happens when experience design is kind of undertaken for the first time?
I think this accentuates the situation because it's very easy to retell and for people to understand why, having empathy would be important, why having those people actually be able to make those changes in how they get their work done. If they don't adopt it, then it doesn't happen. And you could see why there might be some resistance to adopting things that are new when you're in such circumstances where people are very vulnerable. So I think it accentuates it. But we have other examples that are far more in the traditional space that you would imagine, where uncovering something that's perhaps latent or just the pieces haven't been connected before, of understanding the way people interact can actually drive quite a big change.
Thank you very much, Glen. If you found those tales of innovation valuable, please like and subscribe to help us share with more people.
Blueprints of Innovation.
So, Glen, for this second segment, it's a little bit shorter. I aim to focus on tools and methods and give our audience a sense of the technical terms or some of the more advanced stuff that we've mentioned. And I think I would want a description of the discipline in itself, the experience design that you've illustrated. What does that encompass? Where does it come from? And how should people treat it in their organization?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things that I often stress is there's always a person at the end of every experience. And I know nowadays, everyone's automating and looking to use AI, but still, the person buying that mobile phone plan is a human being. The person that needs healthcare or healthcare coverage is a human. No piece of AI is taking out a loan for a mortgage to buy a house. So there's a human at the end of every one of those experiences. So no matter how much we look to streamline and automate that, ultimately there's a customer that needs to be serviced. And I use that term customer to both mean, an external to the organization customer, but also internally, there are internal customers. So anyone that is consuming that product or that service is a customer of it. Mm-hmm. And again, no matter how much we automate, there's still someone that will ultimately want to be able to see and ensure that end customers and consumers are being serviced appropriately. So there's always at least one human, usually two or more, involved in that. So when we think about that experience design, it's the focus on the person that is going to be the consumer of that service or that product. Mm-hmm. And it's understanding that the totality of their experience extends more than just the touch points of interaction with a particular system. It does incorporate how they think, what else they're doing, what might be the moment or the situation in their lives that they're going through. We touch there on both those examples, very different, but both of them dealing with, significant moments that matter in people's lives. And I think it's really important to understand that really successful companies nowadays focus on designing those moments that matter for individuals. No one's particularly interested in having a single transaction. Everyone's looking to build some level of customer loyalty, repeat customers, or continual customers through some kind of as a service. And so it's really important that we're able to think about designing those moments that matter for people, because those are the ones that help shape how they perceive us as a brand. Those are the ones that help shape their opinion of you, whether they're going to share that with friends. And we all know that, a recommendation from a customer goes much further than any advertising recommendation would do. So I think understanding where it fits inside of the organization. It helps inform your product strategy. It helps you reinforce your brand beyond kind of like those very obvious, tangible branding moments, such as, any type of marketing that you're doing or your online presence. All of those are important, but understanding what shapes those moments that matter with clients really helps kind of like create that totality of experience that creates loyal customers that will come back to you time and time again and refer you to other people. And, you are hopefully making their lives better in some small way, while at the same time servicing your organizational goals.
I remember in one context those terms being a moment of truth, and then sometimes being a moment of misery.
Yes.
And so what I'm hearing here is that the experience design discipline is about focusing on these moments that matter, as you called them, but still, of course, taking that within the context of what the organization is trying to achieve, but ensuring that it doesn't inadvertently create a moment of misery just because it was focused on automation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize you kind of use those terms, moments of truth and moments of misery. I think it's almost a folly for an organization to try and create some kind of heightened moment of delight continually with customers. One, it's never going to be sustainable for an organization to be able to operate that way. But also as human beings, when everything's at that level, nothing really stands out. Nothing stands out, and it doesn't create any kind of connection. So
if you had a piece of music that was always kind of
yes,
up.
Yes, I'm certainly not saying that we should try and create moments of friction or frustration with our customers.
Neutral.
But understanding what the really important ones where we want to amplify that would be, whereas just something that's perfectly okay is good enough, and that's always the challenge for companies to understand where to invest some of that effort.
Nice.
And I think I'm not the biggest proponent of NPS as like a really solid metric for understanding customers, but I do think that it kind of highlights one important thing, which it's that 9 and that 10 that really creates the impact. If as an organization you were focused on across your spectrum, let's say you had a large amount fall in kind of like the 4 to 5 category, a team could shift them all the way up to 7 and 8. Metric-wise, that looks like a big shift. But what does it actually do in terms of that customer sentiment? And I think that's the kind of interesting thing around NPS is like, that would be seen as a net neutral, no change. Now that's quite harsh for a team to take because you have made a shift, but perhaps focusing on some of those 4 and 5 moments were not where we should be measuring. We should have been looking at what are the ones we can shift from 8 to 9 or 10. And I think it's really important to understand that NPS for me really only has value when you're having people reflect on a specific moment that they're able to recollect, which is why it often comes, at the end of a customer service call or at the end of some kind of survey. Trying to have them reflect on their entirety of an experience with an organization is very difficult, but having them reflect on a last moment or experience, you can actually get some interesting information back.
Yeah, it's a bit more specific.
Innovators Playbook.
So that's great. You brought us to the third segment, which is about practical advice, right? You've already kind of used the NPS as an example. And I really like how you've already started describing experience design, not just like as a structured discipline, like something that an engineer would do, but we've already mentioned like how you wouldn't want a piece of music to be too much all the time, but the contrast is nice. And it kind of sounds like this is also something that you would want to do with the experience you're providing so that some things stand out. At least that's how I heard you.
Yes.
Was that what you meant?
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely what I mean by kind of like trying to design those moments that matter. So understanding what will be important, but then specifically thinking about designing a standout moment for a customer. And that might be an area where perhaps the most cost-effective or the easiest to scale thing is not necessarily the right thing to do. Counterintuitively, sometimes it'd be like, hey, to create this experience, it is worth us slowing down or spending more effort here because there is, that is a really valued moment by the person that's going to be consuming it. And there are some examples out there that, that these are not my work examples. But one that I read fairly recently was hotels in Hollywood, in LA. They were looking at which ones received the best, the best reviews and the highest reviews. And quite notably, along with kind of like the Four Seasons and all the ones that you would expect to be in there, there's a fairly small, quirky, almost motel-like. But what it does have is it has a few things that it like has as a real standout. So down by the swimming pool area, there's a hotline, which is a popsicle hotline. So you call through and they bring you out a popsicle that you want.
Nice.
Now, it's a little bit of theatre because obviously they could have a self-service, freezer right there and you just go and help yourself to a popsicle. The net result of what you get would be exactly the same. But it is not a crafted experience of you just having to go and pick something up compared to calling and someone bringing out a popsicle specifically for you. So, like that thinking about moments that matter, I don't know whether that one ever would have occurred to me. But in terms of looking at those reviews for people that went to that hotel, it came up time and time again as one of the standout features was the popsicle hotline, which is really curious. So, that is a clear example of there's extra human effort involved there. There's actually slowing down the service that would happen there rather than someone being able to get it themselves. But in that particular moment, that helped create an impactful moment for those people that made a difference than just having something available.
And so let's try and help our audience project themselves, Let's imagine, we're advising a business leader and they are going through a transformation. And, how do they then organize themselves, help their teams to select and make space to create those, that contrast that we were just talking about. Of course, maybe we don't know how the popsicle hotline came about, but how does it work in your experience?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to recognize is when you look across, traversing entire journeys for customers and the amount of people they either directly interact with that they're aware of or what happens, behind stage that they don't see between those touch points. There's a lot there. And it's really not tenable for organizations now to say, we'll spend the human effort investigating all of these moments to find out which are the ones we should focus on. The world is simply moving too fast, change is happening too quickly to do that nowadays. So I think, perhaps paradoxically enough, you're going to hear the designer guys saying, actually, data is really important for us to understand where we should invest some of that very valuable human effort because it's precious and scarce. So having access to your data and being able to interrogate and understand what it's telling you, I think gives you a really good understanding of where something might need attention and focus. And to some extent, it's going to tell you what's going on the surface. But to truly get to an understanding of, what's really going on and why it's going on, that's where kind of like that human effort is really valuable. And so we always try to look at saying, we want to make sure that any findings that we get, we don't call them a proper insight until we have more than one reference point of information. And that should span both qualitative and quantitative and behavioral and attitudinal. So, if you are seeing something in your online usage metrics, great, that's one point. Now you want to be able to find something else that leads you to kind of the same point that perhaps comes from someone's experience with you or your customer complaints that they're putting down qualitatively. And, I think it's really interesting now, the space that we're moving into, where lots of that very large unstructured data that we got before that fell into the qualitative realm couldn't really do a great job of interrogating it. Generative AI starts to allow teams to make sense of far larger sets of information, whereas before we'd have had to either cast that to one side or been very selective in the things that we picked and perhaps really need to do, some direct observation or interviewing on top. I think now we can get a lot further from the information side and use of technologies that then allows the teams to really get that kind of like that last step of deep information from a much smaller effort of actual human to human investigation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it sounds like you really have to be good at understanding the experiences you provide, the services that you're offering, and how they impact people's experiences. That some of it is kind of a qualitative, quantitative.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of data, but just understand, kind of get a heat map in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, connect the dots, see if there is something that repeats. And I guess that's where you just need expertise. You need people who have done this before.
Yes. Yeah. And it's multidisciplinary as an approach, like having people that can bring that data analytics side is really useful. Having people that are good at doing synthesis between different types of information, and then collaboratively having both of those groups' knowledge and experience be able to go through a process of making sense of that information. So like I said, we don't call it an insight until we've got those learnings or data points collected, find commonalities or similarities in them, and then go through a sense-making process to try and help classify what that might be telling us, that we can then ultimately try and set up as a hypothesis, because even the best information doesn't always give you the full picture the minute you try and change something. So for us, in each of those situations, the next thing to do would be like, okay, what's the smallest experiment we can run in order for us to understand whether, like our hypothesis is correct and we wish to proceed.
Interesting. So we're kind of in between both the artistic world where, subjectively a leader might sort of orient the service sets that they're responsible for towards something that creates more contrast we were kind of doing the artsy stuff, and I see that it's both. It's that your last answer was very much about data science and engineering and hypotheses and almost the scientific method. So it's a very diverse domain in fact, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, like that extends to being a cross-functional collaborative exercise. I think it's beneficial to go outside of your team to pull in points of view and expertise in helping shape this. It really should be a collaborative exercise going through it. And to me, kind of like when you talked about those two things there, you're almost defining what I would kind of like phrase as creativity. For me, when I think about creativity, and I've often gone through an exercise of asking people to kind of very quickly sketch as a warm-up exercise. I'll say kind of 4 words. My standard 4 words are house, cat, which everyone can manage to sketch really quickly. And then I will say innovation and creativity. And those last two, I'll often get a light bulb and an artist's palette. And it shapes that a lot of people, when they think of creativity, think about artistic endeavor or artistic talent. But for me, creativity is about finding a solution for which there's no apparent answer. So I don't say for which no answer has ever been found before. No apparent answer might be it hasn't happened inside of your organization or in your particular domain space. So being able to work through that challenge and come up with an idea of how to solve it, and then working out whether that idea is valid or not, is kind of the definition of creativity. And that spans both design as well as more analytical kind of scientific approaches that you kind of mentioned.
As we're about to finish the interview soon, are there any final messages you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think, like large ones for me is when they think about design and designing experiences. That surface layer that traditionally was the UI is one piece of it. And more we're seeing, those boundaries stretched. So lots of people, would instinctively ask me, well, now we're seeing more standardization in UI. Is your sphere dying? It's like, not really, actually. It means that some of those problems we grappled with for many years, solving them over and over again in particular circumstances, we've now managed to get a good understanding of how to solve them more holistically. Mm-hmm. That allows us to elevate up from that to the next level of experience that we're trying to solve for. So for me, it actually kind of shifts and helps elevate what that means. So that would be my first one of please don't equate that design is only about, or user experience is only about the UI. And I think the second one would be that, while you will have people that have experience and skill and talent in this area as a practiced craft, they need to be in the room and helping to orchestrate it. But design is most effective when it's a team sport, when it's collaborative. I've never seen it be very effective when, no matter how talented those people are, they go off on their own to craft something and then just try and share the results of it back. It's far more powerful when people go through that whole experience themselves to understand how we came up with those ideas, with those visions, and then ultimately those designs for those solutions. It has far more longevity when it's done that way.
Wonderful. And on that note, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex.
That's it for this episode of Innovation Tales. Today, we got a first-hand expert account of what it takes to deliver human-centered innovation in an era of rapid technological change. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Or you can also rate and review the show in your favorite podcasting app. We look forward to your feedback. In the meantime, we have more topics and guests lined up, so stay tuned for more tales of innovation that inspire, challenge, and transform. Until next time, peace.
Thanks for tuning in to Innovation Tales. Get inspired, connect with other practitioners, and approach the digital revolution with confidence. Visit innovation-tales.com for more episodes. See you next time.